Hello and welcome to the On the Couch podcast, the podcast that gives you the view from the therapist chair. I'm your host, John Dennis, a licensed professional counselor. You're listening to OTC episode 46 with Duane, author of Military in the Rearview Mirror. Hello again, OTC listeners. Thank you, as always, for stopping by. This week, I'm bringing an episode about military mental health. I got to sit down with Duane, who is a licensed mental health counselor and a host of a podcast, actually two podcasts, and an author. He works specifically with veterans' mental health, and I don't know. I've grown up in ex-military family. I've had a lot of family members that have been in the service, and I always say, I have such a huge respect for our military, our armed services, the men and women that give their lives, give their careers, give so much to defending our nation and our freedoms and serving in the military. And, there's an old joke in the military that, if the military had wanted you to have a family, they would have issued you one. And, that concept that they ask a lot, they need a lot, they demand a lot, and it's hard. It's hard for those that are in the service, and it's, hard on military families. A lot of them, they wouldn't have it any other way. They love it, and it's given them so much, but it also comes at a cost. And it made me think of, I have a good buddy of mine, Chris, who he's one of those. He's devoted his life, his career to the military, and he always was that, that round peg, like there wasn't really any question for him. He was going into the military. He kind of knew from birth almost that, this was for him. And he loves it. But he's been very open with me about just the impact that being deployed has had on him and in his different experiences and theaters of war and, everything that he's been through. And it's been hard. It's been really difficult because at times, feeling like other people don't understand and even, loved ones don't understand. And it's just really struggling with how do you deal with some of what you've seen or what you've done, and what does that mean to reach out for help, and does that say something about you? And there were points with Chris where there was some pretty low points where I was privileged to walk alongside him at times when he really didn't know if he was going to make it through, if which way he was going to turn. Things were pretty dicey there for a while when he was at his real low points. And thankfully, the VA and just a lot of the services that are out there, he was able to take advantage of some of those and get the help that he needed. And with military and veteran mental health, that crisis line, the military and veterans crisis line, is such a huge resource. And that's just one story. The National Council for Behavioral Health quotes that less than 50% of returning veterans in need of services actually receive mental health treatment, which is staggering. I think a lot of people in today's world are familiar with the Veterans Administration. Their reports that approximately 22 veterans die by suicide every day. And I always say with stats like this, it often goes underreported. So the numbers are typically more than that. It's just not something we're aware of. It's not reported. And again, this is just stats talking about veterans, in terms of family members, spouses, children. It's such a huge thing. And for people, especially that, transition out of the military, that can be really hard. That was one of the things I really appreciated about talking with Duane is, that reality of what do you do afterwards. And I would really encourage you to check out his book, The Military in the Rearview Mirror. It was very eye-opening for me, and it gave me a lot of great resources and context for when I'm working with veterans. For any of you that may be struggling yourselves or may be connected to a veteran that is struggling, I would really recommend that Military and Veterans Crisis Line. So if you call 1-800-273-8255 and press number 1, they also have a chat feature at their website. So that's veteranscrisisline.net. And you can also text to the number 838255. And they also have a separate line for support for deaf and hard of hearing that is 1-800-799-4889. And again, I'll have all of this in the show notes for anyone that needs to access it. So I hope you enjoy the conversation that I was able to have with Duane. So for those that don't already know him, Duane France is the Director for Veterans Services with the Family Care Center. It's a private mental health clinic in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He's also the Executive Director, of the Colorado Veterans Health and Wellness Agency, which it's a 501c3 nonprofit. It's professionally affiliated with the Family Care Center. And so upon retiring from the Army after a 22-year career, including 5 combat and operational deployments, Duane France began serving as a clinical mental health counselor in 2014. And he's a member of the inaugural class of the George W. Bush Institute Veteran Leadership Program, a program that supports individuals from diverse sectors across the country that are motivated to increase their impact in helping our nation's veterans. So in addition to his clinical work, he also writes and speaks about veteran mental health in a wide variety of settings. He's presented at national conferences on mental health and wellness in the military population, authored 3 books. He's the founder and host of the Headspace and Timing, a blog and podcast that brings the information from the clinical community to service members, veterans, and their families. And he's been published in numerous local and national media outlets and writes an online column for Counseling Today. So I have on the show today Duane France, who is an LPC, and he is the host of the Headspace and Timing podcast. So Duane, welcome to the show.
No, I appreciate you having me. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, really appreciate, man, all of the work you have done and do. Thank you for your service, then, now, and always. So yeah. Give us a little bit background. What do you do? How'd you get there? Yeah.
Well, maybe that's sort of it's always interesting trying to cram 25 years in about a 5-minute bio. But so I retired from the Army in 2014 after 22 years. I have 5 combat and operational deployments. So 1 Iraq, 2 Afghanistans, Bosnia way back in the last century. Finished out my career. I like to say I've been here in Colorado since 2006. The family's been here. Of course, I've been on the Grand World Tour, but retired outside of Fort Carson, Colorado. In 2015, I got my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling, and then have been a clinical mental health counselor ever since. I serve exclusively veterans and their families. I've done some stuff with Justice Involved Veterans, but now I'm the executive director of a nonprofit that's affiliated with our practice. Practice is a private outpatient clinic that serves service members, veterans, and their families here in Southern Colorado.
Nice. And the headspace and timing. Can the name? How did you come to that? What's the mission of the show?
Sure. Yeah. So the headspace and timing is probably back in about 2016. I was working very closely with a lot of clients, but a mentor of mine had said, a lot of people kind of need to know some of the stuff that you're talking about. So she recommended that I start writing, and that's really where the blog started. Headspace and timing refers to a military term. We have a weapon that's called the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. Mm-hmm. And the 50 cal is a very durable weapon. You can drop it in the dirt, you can throw it off a cliff, and it can still operate, right? It is a there are some weapons that I use in Afghanistan that were used in the Korean War, right? So these are some really, really strong, durable weapons. However, for them to work properly, they had to have their head space, so the space between the bolt and the barrel of the gun, and the timing, right? So the way that the firing pin strikes the round, they have to have their headspace and timing set correctly. And the headspace and timing gauge is something that's really about the size of my thumb. So it's this huge durable weapon that's really controlled by this very small thing and made effective or ineffective. And my analogy is veterans are very much the same thing. You can throw us off a cliff, you can throw us in the dirt, and we're still effective unless we don't have our headspace and timing set correctly. So really it was the idea of how to help service members, veterans, sometimes military families understand that you're not alone in this. Transitioning out of the military is difficult. There are definitely some challenges. So after about a year of doing the blog, I was invited by some of my veteran colleagues to start a podcast, and that's where the Headspace and Timing podcast sort of came out of.
It's an interesting choice of words, invited to start a podcast.
Right, and this was some good friends of mine. They're putting together a podcast network that is sort of this. I was on a couple of their episodes, and they were like, "Well, why don't you just stay here since you're?" But they brought in, they developed a couple of different shows. There weren't a lot of shows about mental health from a veteran perspective at that point. Another friend of ours is a Green Beret, bringing on a different perspective. So sort of developing shows underneath their network. And then January of last year, really kind of split it out, created its own show. Right now the show's on hiatus. I'm in the middle of doing another project called Seeking the Military Suicide Solution podcast. Yeah. So this is a podcast that's we're producing in partnership with Military Times, which is a pretty big national military publication, and a set 50-episode series looking at suicide, addressing suicide in the military population, moving beyond awareness into action, and how can we actually make a difference. So really, and a couple of books came out of it, and just a lot of free time on my hands after I retired.
Yeah. It made me think of it's sort of that like Swiss Army knife, kind of idea of like, it does everything.
That's much more charitable than Jack of all trades, master of none.
Yeah. Well, there's master of. I would say none is selling yourself pretty short. So yeah. That idea of the solution, that project, the podcast that you're working on now. So is that you're kind of in the midst of that, or you're doing all of the interviews and the research and banking that to put them out all at once, or
No, so we're right now we're about halfway through. We're producing a weekly show, and I think we just released our 20th episode, and really it's something. I have a co-host. She and I are doing this in partnership. She's a nationally recognized expert when it comes to suicide prevention. So she and I, the hope behind the show was really that we're looking at a wide range of different solutions, and that we would have some things emerge out of it, some common things that the guests would talk about that are pretty similar. And it's really a misnomer in that it's not one solution. There is no solution to stopping any kind of suicide, much less service member, veteran, military family. Because if there was, we would have found it by now.
That'd be nice. But
But really, it's a matter of looking at how do we have this comprehensive solution or a number of different solutions for a number of different situations.
Sure. And in terms of the work that you've been doing with that, but also off of your book, Military in the Rearview Mirror, can you? I kind of want to give you some space to unpack that, and what are some of the things you typically try to communicate to the public and veterans as well?
So one of the biggest things, and this is something not even a lot of veterans are aware of, but as a clinician, as a practicing counselor, we're taught that we have to be culturally competent, right? We have to be aware of how someone else's worldview impacts, how they think and what they're doing. And so one of the most basic things that I tell people is that by any definition of culture, the military is a different culture, right? We have our own way of dressing. We have our own language, right? I speak acronym and expletive fluently, right? But it's, in the way I describe it is that it's like as if I went and lived in Ireland for 22 years. Yeah, we speak English, but it's a totally different culture. It's a different mindset. And then I had to now reintegrate into a different culture. And so really my focus is trying to help individuals that are working with veterans is to understand that we truly do think differently, the same way that someone that grew up in a rural Midwest community would think differently than someone who grew up in an urban East Coast community, right? And so we have to understand that veterans think, see, know different things. We have much more global experience. I've been as many countries as I've been states. And that leads to a different worldview. And so understanding that and for counselors working with veterans, developing cultural competence around what they're talking about is critical whenever we're trying to serve veterans. So that's really where the book started coming from, was to, one, to help veterans know that they're not alone, to help veterans' family members understand more about them, because it's much easier for a military spouse to ask me why their husband is thinking a certain way than it is to ask that particular individual. Or it's a lot easier for a veteran to hand their parents one of my books and say, this is why I think this way, rather than them having to do it. But then also providers that are interested in working with veterans, it's a good way to sort of, crack open and get a little bit of insight into the military mindset.
And in reading the book, one of the things I appreciated was, it's a great read. I mean, it's very real. It's very down to earth. And that concept of it's not all, PTSD and TBI, that there's a lot more to it than that. And, you talk in there about that continuum specific to suicidal ideation. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit? Yeah.
So, and this is something that when it comes to talking about suicide, there are those people who delve into it a lot. And so it's something that they're very, very steeped in, right? They could talk about Joiner's interpersonal theory, suicide. And then there's people that really don't know that a lot, that much about it. And so one of the misconceptions about suicide is this idea that you're either always suicide. It's an on or off switch. It's binary, either that you're either suicidal or you're not. But really, there's three different stages when it comes to someone's suicidality. First, when it comes to ideation, so really vague suicidal ideation in that, maybe it'd be better if I wasn't here today, or, it really sucks and I could be gone, right? So these vague thoughts, I'm not thinking specifically about the words of kill, death, or suicide. Then you have specific ideations, which is another stage beyond that, which is more on, I could really kill myself. I could really take my own life. I could do myself self-harm. That's another stage of thinking that goes beyond just the today really sucks. Then you move into the second stage when it starts to go into contemplation of how am I going to do it, right? What is the plan? What would I do? Thinking about specific ways of doing it, and then to actually putting that plan into action. Things like I'm going to go jump off of this location or drive, whatever it is, right? But actually starting to gather materials or start to put that plan into action. Then, of course, you get into the third stage, which is the behaviors of I'm starting to enact that plan to I actually engage in that. And so if you think about this continuum of idea, contemplation, and then the actual actions and the behaviors, the farther you down you get to that behavior and taking it, the more danger you're in. Living Works. I was an applied suicide intervention skills trainer in the last couple of years before I retired from the Army. And ASSIST is really one of the gatekeeper trainings to help individuals understand more about suicide prevention. And they use the analogy of a river, and then the closer you get to the river, and it's the waterfall. The farther down you get to that, the waterfall is when you go off the edge, when you actually attempt suicide. The farther down that you get, the more momentum you have, the harder it is to intervene. And so it's much better to...
Current is stronger.
Exactly. It's, it's easier to address it when we're having these vague thoughts or even the specific thoughts. It's easier to stop it then. Once you get farther down, and again, a lot of people have seen that, suicide is a matter of time. People will flash through these stages in a matter of minutes, or people may linger in these stages in weeks, months, or even years. And so again, it's really complicated. But when I talk to my clients about this continuum of suicide, I say, when we're at this point, we can talk about it. Once it gets that point, we're going to stop talking about it. We're going to do something. But giving the veterans that I work with, the clients that I work with, the ability to say, hey, if you're thinking these thoughts, let's talk about it and figure out why you're having that to keep you from getting farther down that continuum.
Yeah. Thank you so much for unpacking that, because I think that obviously is such an important concept for people to understand. And a lot of people that aren't steeped in this, usually have that like off on, like, oh, well, that's a very selfish thing. I've never struggled with that. How could you think that? All those things that come with it. And I think also, some of what you unpack in the book about, as people in armed services, that idea of utility and being used to being very competent and being useful. And I know you talk in there about sense of purpose and hope being crucial in terms of life after and during as well. But can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
And this is something that goes back to what you were talking about, is it's not just, PTSD and TBI. If there was a pie of veteran mental health, people think there are two slices, PTSD and TBI, and there's not. We have the medical model of mental health where PTSD is a diagnosable condition. There's medications for it. You and I can bill for it, bill insurances for it. Mm-hmm. Many people know that substance abuse is rampant. It's rampant in communities, but it is something that people come across with veterans. But then there's a number of different non-medical, let's say non-clinical conditions that you can't find them in the DSM. There's no diagnosis. And one of them is a sense of purpose and meaning, like you said, a feeling of usefulness or utility. When I was in the military, that was baked in, right? They told me what my meaning was. Mm-hmm. And generally I'll sort of break it down a little bit more. A sense of purpose is having something to do, whereas meaning is the satisfaction behind it. But here we're talking much more about things like Viktor Frankl and Rollo May and Irvin Yalom. When this is existential, what meaning do I place on my place in the world and what I'm doing? When I was in the military, I had a purpose. I had meaning. I was part of something larger than myself. All of the elements that, again, Yalom and Frankel talk about existential balance, it's kind of there. I have a friend of mine who wasn't in the military, but he talks about how he had to create a place for himself in the world. There wasn't a him-shaped hole, right? There wasn't a mechanic-shaped hole or a doctor-shaped hole because he just didn't fit. He had learning disabilities. He had some other stuff going on. For me, there was a place for me in the world. There was a me-shaped hole, and that's when I was in the military. I'm no longer allowed to be in that place. I now have to create a different place for myself in the world. And so that leaves a big space in people's lives, whether they get out willingly or unwillingly. If we're not deliberate about how we fill that space, then it's going to be filled for us by disrupted relationships and substances and things like that. So not all the veterans that I see struggle with purpose and meaning in some way. All but two, and literally two I can think of, and the hundreds of veterans have saved in some way with finding a sense of purpose after the military. And again, so that's the thing is, and it can be similar with first responders once they get done, once they retire and from there. But anything, teachers even, that they're not doing that anymore, we have to figure out how to help them fill that hole. Because if they don't, you're not really addressing the whole situation.
Sure. And it always makes me think of White Christmas and the idea of, what do you do with a general, that song of like, what do you do when they come home and they're not a general anymore? That idea of much of their lives have been spent in that pursuit, in that career path, toward that end, and that's what they know. That's their identity. Like you said, that sense of
right. Yeah, and identity is exactly what you are talking about. I had another friend of mine who said that once he was medically retired, the Army told him he could not be him anymore. Mm-hmm. Like, I cannot be me, right? And so we have these identities of professionals, of parents, of siblings, so we have all these different labels, but they're us, right? We create our own identity. And for a lot of service members, their identity is wrapped up in what they did in the military. And to fully transition, the military in many ways is a disrupted transformation. We're transforming from one thing into another thing. So the military transitioned me from a civilian into a soldier, and then over a period of time. And then what do I become next after that? And so that's something that many of the trends noticing, that we don't do a very good job helping service members transition to continue to transform beyond what we experienced into something, integrating that into ourselves. Arguably, and this is what I tell my clients, I have as much, if not more, purpose and meaning now in my life than I did when I was in the military, because I did some stupid stuff when I was in the military that wasn't very meaningful, like guarding blank walls and staring at that hill for 7 hours, right? But now I am able to do things that create satisfaction, that are meaningful and purposeful. And so I don't struggle with that in my post-military life because I have very deliberately addressed that part of it.
Mm. Wow. Yeah. That idea of purpose and identity, it also made me think of Kevin Hines, his Crack Not Broken, and I've had the chance to hear him speak. He talks a lot about one of the most crucial things that you can do in working with somebody who struggles with suicidal ideation is, connecting them or helping them to identify that purpose and that hope.
Right.
I do want to touch on the concept of moral injury because I know that's something that's become much more identified. For those that aren't familiar with the term, can you sort of unpack that and explain it?
Yeah, and again, that's another aspect of veteran mental health. I mean, in not necessarily solely to service members and veterans and those who serve, but it is a non-clinical aspect. There is no DSM diagnosis for moral injury. Mm-hmm. It was really, it's one of these things that have sort of always been there, but then putting a name to it. People who are interested in looking more, I highly recommend Jonathan Shea's book, Achilles in Vietnam. And Shea was a non-military psychologist that was working with Vietnam veterans in the 80s, and then he published his book in the 90s. But his was really one of the first books, I think, that sort of identified this idea of sometimes we do things that are against our values, whether it's, instilled values growing up, maybe it's spiritual values, maybe it's norms that we got from our parents. But he saw these Vietnam veterans were struggling with things that they had to do while they were in Vietnam that they found morally reprehensible, let's say. And, and not to say that they were immoral, right? We're not talking about, these moral things. It's more about, and this is the way I describe it, is moral injury is something that I believe to be true has been violated, either by me or by someone else. Another really great starting point would be really one of the initial articles, I think it was about 2008 or 2009, from Brett Litz and his colleagues, which really kind of described it. It's perpetrating, witnessing, or being unable to prevent acts that violate deeply held beliefs. So really thinking about things like, Abu Ghraib in the Iraq War, or My Lai in Vietnam, like these atrocities of, those National Guard MPs in Abu Ghraib. They didn't grow up thinking, I'm going to torture and document the torture of detainees. That wasn't part of their. It just. It got to that part where they found themselves in that situation. And so moral injury is really where we feel like we've betrayed something in ourselves. There's a number of, this is an emerging concept. Some people consider it part of post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people consider it as a subset of it, or something even distinct. So you do have these things like, here's a great example is I've talked to a colleague who has a bunch of friends who are Marines. And so the Marines in Somalia, in the mid-'90s, they were being attacked, and they were being attacked by young men, teenagers, really. And then they found that they started having disrupted relationships with their own sons as they grew into their teenage years. Because of this, they reminded me, but you're not supposed to, fight child soldiers. And again, there are some things like leadership. I was supposed to protect my soldiers, and I didn't bring everyone home. A core belief that I have of I'm supposed to bring everyone home, and I didn't. That's really more of a meaning injury. Dr. Ed Tick describes it as an injury of the soul, something that I believe deeply in the world has been changed. So we have these things, and it's not atrocities, it's not war crimes, it's that things that I believe to be true have been somehow violated by me. But then you also have these things where when we learn things in a different environment. When I was in Iraq, there was no such thing as a stop sign. There were no speed limits. The one-way street, which was whichever way I was going, right? And so because we have a different set of rules and laws or rules of engagement and how you can act and not act, some of these other things didn't necessarily apply. Now I have to come back to a land of rules and laws where there are stoplights and speed limits and different rules. And I just lived for a year, maybe a year and a half, where I didn't have to follow those rules. Now I do have to follow those rules, but I don't want to because I had a kind of a freedom. And so moral injury is exactly. And so it's this idea of, thinking about the moral compass. It's about what I believe to be true has been fundamentally changed by what I experienced in the military, really more specifically in combat.
And how does that connect to, a lot of people really struggle afterwards, I've found, with I'm not supposed to need help. I'm supposed to have it all together. Do you see that also as part of the moral injury of? You're listening to OTC episode 46 with Duane France, author of Military in the Rearview Mirror. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsor.
Would you like to talk to a counselor but can't find the time? Would you rather talk to someone from the comfort of your own home? If so, Parenting and Family Solutions is here to help. We now offer teletherapy to all clients who reside in the state of Pennsylvania. Using our secure portal, you can have a video session with your counselor using a laptop, desktop computer, or smartphone. Visit our website to learn more at www.parentfamilysolutions.com or give us a call at 717-602-5560 to see if teletherapy might be a good fit for you. Let us help you build a stronger family and a healthier you.
How does that connect to, a lot of people really struggle afterwards. I've found with, I'm not supposed to need help. I'm supposed to have it all together. Do you see that also as part of the moral injury of?
No, yes, yeah, no, I do agree. I mean, that is a core belief that a lot of service members have. I'm supposed to be the dependable one. I'm supposed to be strong. I'm supposed to be capable. And when I show myself to be not that anymore, that is something that it's hard for me to overcome. Mm-hmm. There's been in really you're talking about stigma against help seeking. Yeah. There was a study a number of years ago that showed that veterans apply stigma differently to themselves than they do to other veterans. Uh-huh. In that, if one of the questions was, I think other people will think I'm weak for seeking help, something like 40% veterans endorse that. A similar question was, I think other veterans are weak for seeking help, something like 12 or 13%, right? Yeah. So we want our fellow veterans, our service members, our brothers and our sisters, we want them to get help, but applying that stigma to ourselves, it's very different. That is one of the things that really we have to change the culture around help seeking in our nation, but also in these professions where, strength and ability and solidness, the ability to handle immense amounts of stress. So, we're talking right now is, frontline healthcare workers, emergency room doctors, firefighters, first responders. They have this image that they feel like they have to live up to, and that's what they believe to be true. And then when they act in a different way other than that belief, it causes them discomfort.
Sure. Well, and yeah, starting to get into some of those solutions. I know you said it's not, cookie cutter, one size fits all, but what do you think are some good steps?
Well, one of the things, and if we're talking about how to help service members who are struggling in reintegrating or transition or whatever you want to use, is understanding that, number one, it's not always PTSD. Not every. I had a colleague who had asked me how many deployments you have, and I said, I had 5, and she said, well, of course you have PTSD.
Yeah.
Well,
it's obligatory.
Not really, right?
Automatically get that.
Yeah. My second Afghanistan deployment, the latrine was in the same building I slept in. It was not a very difficult deployment, right? It was pretty easy. Mm-hmm. So just because I was deployed doesn't mean it's an automatic one-to-one. At the same time, just because someone wasn't deployed doesn't mean they don't have PTSD. So really understanding that the idea of it's not all PTSD and TBI, but really trying to dig into what is the major concern, what is the challenge that we're having. I had a Vietnam veteran who, for years, had been told that what he was dealing with was PTSD. He believed it himself. But when we walk through sort of the history of what was going on, all of his suicide attempts were around him being rejected in some way. And it was more relational, right? So mother passing away, or a marriage breaking up, or being rejected in some way by somebody he saw in authority. So really it was more about, we spent more time addressing how he felt about his relationships and interpersonal relationships than we ever did on PTSD. He said, Vietnam was kind of fun for me. I really don't have that kind of issue. It was more about how his relationships were based on how he perceived the rejection, the very accurate rejection that Vietnam veterans experienced in the 70s. But his reaction to that rejection in the 70s then disrupted his patterns for his relationships for the last 50 years, which is what we needed to work on. So really some of the solution is understanding what is the actual problem and addressing the problem rather than addressing what we think the problem should be.
Yeah. So, some of the just education, training, and research, do you think it needs to start way back at volunteering and boot camp and how we're helping to prepare, start with the end in mind kind of idea?
There is a number of that. I am more on the other end of the spear, that it really doesn't matter which came first, the chicken or the egg. If you got a bunch of chickens running around, where it started really didn't matter.
Sure.
But I do have colleagues that say, yes, we do need to start talking about resilience in basic military training, whether it's boot camp or basic training or basic officer course. Or I actually had a consultation last week, I think, with a West Point cadet, where she is in charge of West Point, the military academy for the Army. She's in charge of their cadet-led suicide prevention program next year. And she wanted to ask me, how do we incorporate conversations about moral injury for these future leaders in the Army? So yes, I think that it's absolutely necessary that we start having these conversations in the beginning, to sort of ward off some of this stuff. So building resilience ahead of time. And that's also part of it that can change the culture. One of the things that needs to be done in stigma reduction is we need to change the culture around help seeking, or around how we talk about certain conditions, right? We've gone from calling someone a schizophrenic to someone who has schizophrenia or has been diagnosed. So we're changing the terminology, and definitely in the clinical space, but we also need to get that in the hands of those that are actually experiencing this. Sure.
Yeah. I don't know, it made me think of just that idea of, trying to shift gears, in a stick shift car, like just trying to, drop gears really quickly, and the difficulty of like, okay, well, we need you to, be able to act very quickly, and it's got to be second nature. But then also incorporating some of the help seeking and some of the other things. Yeah, it's not an easy balance. Like you said, not a cookie cutter, one size fits all. Yeah.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and that analogy really is a very valid one. In the military, we needed to be that automatic, right? I did it when I was a platoon sergeant in Afghanistan leading patrols. I told my soldiers, don't put pictures of mama and baby in your helmet, right? I don't want pictures on the dashboard. I don't want booties hanging from, keep that stuff on the fob. Don't think about that, because here I need your head in the game.
Yeah.
And that was appropriate and that was necessary. At the same time, once that time for that is done, we need to help them transition. One of the things that I've seen, and maybe for me, a measure of my success, is I had a long time to prepare for leaving the military. If we think of Prochaska and DiClemente's stages of change, the military puts you out whether you're ready to change or not. Whether your mindset is,
there's the door.
You could be in pre-contemplation stage where I can't consider myself being out of the military, but the Army says you got to be, it's action stage.
You're done.
Yeah. And so having more time, I was able to go through the stages of getting my mindset to go in the military. And some of the veterans that I've worked with that have had better transitions had more of a lead time, a year, 18 months, however long, to be able to change their mind and come to terms psychologically with the change. The ones that have had the most difficulty are the ones where that change was very abrupt. And so that idea of going from sixth gear to first gear, it's much easier if you go through all the gears at once rather than jumping from sixth gear to first gear, which is really what a lot of veterans feel like, is going from 90 miles an hour to slamming on the brakes when they leave the military.
Well, and a lot of times I've talked with people about especially Korea and Vietnam, the introduction of the chopper, as that having to really shift gears that fast, of like being on the front lines and then being on an R&R, where you really started to see a lot of the difficulty really take off. I felt, I don't know if you feel similar.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. As a matter of fact, I have a client who demonstrated that. He had probably 3 or 4 different deployments, but like many of us, and it's almost cliche that within 72 hours of your last firefight, you're sitting at a cafe or a coffee shop. But we were going through and talking about some of his deployments, but we talked about what one of his best experiences was redeployment. And one of his deployments, he was detailed to go on a ship that left the Persian Gulf that was taking some equipment back. And he said it took him something like 3 or 4 weeks to get back, instead of flying a 747 from the Middle East and landing in really, it wasn't automatically back in the States, but really, getting back very quickly. And he was sort of surprised. He was like, you know what? I never realized that deployment was much easier to reintegrate from than the other ones, because of the rapidity of going through that. And I experienced that myself. I often describe this. Came back from Afghanistan, literally, our last patrol. Long story short, but I was sort of shadowing. I was supporting the unit that was taking over for us, and me and one of my fellow leaders went along this patrol. And then our bags were packed, and we were on a plane, literally hours after we got off of our last patrol. Then we went back to, my wife is from Tennessee, and my brother-in-law and I were building a deck for our parents-in-law, so our sister's parents. And this entire week, I'm still on Afghanistan time. I'm still thinking about, they're on the route this day, or this is where that's happening. And I had a good experience. Like I really connected with the folks that took over from me. And I was sort of screaming in my head because nobody was asking about it. Nobody was talking about it. Right. Nobody, it's a great summer day in the hills of eastern Tennessee, and a beer at the end of the day. And so I'm walking around pissed off because nobody is asking me about Afghanistan. And then, probably after 3 or 4 days, winding down for the day, and me and my brother-in-law were kicking back with a beer. And finally he turns to me and he says, "So what was it like over there?" And immediately at that moment, I didn't want to tell him. I'd been wanting to tell him for days, but then the minute he asked, I totally shut down. I was like, it was rough. It was bad, And so it's this kind of thing, is not having that ability to communicate what our experiences were. I call that the paradox of the veteran story, is we want people to know what we experienced, but at the same time, there's no way that we're going to be able to get anybody to help us tell that story. Okay.
And I have a couple of listener questions that I think might kind of dovetail with that. There's just that back and forth, the like, well, when I'm ready, they're not, and vice versa. And I know I just talked with Dr. Christine Moutier yesterday off of American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and they're really pushing in hard with this, hashtag Real Convo kind of campaign. So I'm kind of curious, is there any way for other soldiers to help in like peer support and checking in. I don't know how much you do around that.
Sure. Well, and I think that peer support is a critical component for any kind of mental health, right? I mean,
Sure.
we see it in AA. AA has been a peer-led, the recovery community has definitely taken the lead on this peer support and really bought into it. And I think it has a lot of utility in my experience in the veteran space, in that a peer who has lived experience can definitely get to a place where, like, if my brother-in-law had served, and maybe he was in the Gulf, and
Sure.
it would have been easier, for me to be able to talk to him about that because I know that he would have been there. And so I think that for clinicians who are working with veterans, in some way connecting with a peer-led group, that's really, of course, the VFW and the Legion and veteran service organizations are doing a lot of that. But really, that's what some of the basis of these new age veteran service organizations, things like Team Rubicon, Team Red, White, and Blue, where they do fitness, the Mission Continues, where it's all about community engagement. That's really what this is fellow service members supporting each other. There is actually had, and it was this episode, the 20th episode of Seeking the Military Suicide Solution we released was about a program called Vets for Warriors, and my guest was retired Major General Mark Graham, who lost one of his sons to suicide, and then 7 or 8 months later lost another one of his sons to an improvised explosive device in Iraq. And he and his wife experienced this double loss, but also they experienced how people reacted to that double loss in different ways.
Sure.
And so Vets for Warriors is a national helpline. It's not a crisis line. It's not a suicide prevention line, but it's a helpline that's staffed by other NCOs by other veterans that are trained peers to be able to do that. It's another great organization called Objective Zero. It's a technology-based app that was created by active duty service members and trains peers, they call them ambassadors, to be able to be there. And so really it's not non-clinical. They do have some basic experience, but they also don't have the clinical licensing training. Mm-hmm. I do believe that peers have a huge role to play when it comes to helping individuals struggle with telling some of their stories.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. Definitely make sure to, kind of pack the show notes with resources if people want to get to that. One of the listener questions that came in is, it's actually somebody who is a clinician. She was asking, what protocol do you use for determining moral injury? And any assessment or any protocol or
Yeah, so there's actually some great assessments that are out there. I would say Dr. Joseph Currier and his colleagues from University of South Alabama have developed the Expressions of Moral Injury Event Scale. So it's more about how has my moral injury expressed itself. Dr. Litz and his colleagues have developed the Moral Injury Event Scale. So there are a number of assessments and evidence-based assessments. I mean, they've researched them and worked with them through a number of different trials. I personally use, and when I'm working with justice-involved veterans, I use the Expressions of Moral Injury Event Scale by Joseph Currier and his colleagues.
Awesome. Yeah, I know she had referenced like the imagined conversation and a pie chart example from adaptive disclosure and things like that.
So those are in adaptive disclosure definitely is a protocol to address some of this, right? So in those what I was talking about, that was really more on the assessment side
to identify.
Dr. Litz and his colleagues have developed adaptive disclosure, which is another form of Gestalt therapy, right? Which is another form of the imagined conversation. I have had some colleagues that say really something like cognitive processing therapy towards the morally injurious event, not towards a traumatic event, right? So how do I think about this event, and how do I change the way that I think about this event?
Shifting the narrative.
Right. And then there's definitely some work. A colleague from here in the VA in Colorado, Dr. Jacob Farnsworth, is looking at acceptance and commitment therapy. So ACT, using ACT to address morally injurious beliefs or beliefs that I am somehow morally injured.
And with working with families and loved ones, trying to help them understand some of this. I mean, I imagine, a large part of that is like, look, it's not a linear, like you said, it's not binary, like some of what we were talking with the continuum. That there's going to be good days and bad days. You're going to take some steps forward. Sometimes we have to go back over stuff, and you got it. You made some progress, in a certain way in one session, and then maybe you have to go back to it again and kind of get it all over again.
Yeah, but also I think in my experience, many family members just want to know why. Like, why is this happening? What's going on in my veteran's head, right? Why do they react this way when I say that, but that way when I say this? And so for them, it really is helping them understand why these things are happening. For a number of years ago, I was co-leading a group of veteran spouses, right? So the veterans were in a partial hospitalized program, but we had the separate group for the spouses of the individuals there. And my role there was to answer their questions, right? Why does he do that when this happens? I was able to explain to them why the military mindset is, in a way that I wasn't able to explain to my wife, right? My wife would, the same way that they couldn't ask their husbands, or again, parents to their children. And that's really some of the benefit of what some of the blogs and even the books have been, is a way for a veteran to be able to say, well, this is why I'm thinking what I'm thinking, and they're like, oh, right. So this is the first step towards change, is awareness, right? So it's helping family members become aware this is why these things are happening. And then once you know the why, then maybe you can be a little bit understanding about the what.
Definitely. Obviously, so well said. That idea of just having some of these conversations and being willing to slog through it. Sometimes it's like you said with your brother-in-law, like it just wasn't the right time. It was, I was at a different space. And I think people having the willingness to kind of deal with that and try again, or, go a little bit at a time, just kind of ease their way into some of these conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I don't say that every veteran or every clinician that is working with veteran needs to have military service. Number one, there's simply not enough of us. But number two, anybody who's able to build trust and rapport, maybe I have a shortcut, but building trust and rapport is about building trust and rapport. Yes, we do have to become culturally competent, and we can't be asking them, what does IED mean or things like that. We have to have a basis of shared background knowledge. But once you have that shared background knowledge, any clinician can work with a veteran to be able to establish that trust, to be able to have those uncomfortable conversations.
And I think the idea of being willing to open up and say that as the clinician, being able to bring up hey, I want to check in, I don't have a background in this. Is that going to, how do you feel about that? Are we still able to work through that? And then, bringing that up along the way. I think, like you said, building that trust and rapport. I think as long as clinicians and others approach it from a place of respect and, caring, I think the person will be able to pick up on that.
Yes, exactly. I've got a friend of mine who describes as he was a combat veteran, a Marine who had gone to a clinician, and the clinician told him exactly that. Said, "Are you sure you want to work with me?" Because I wasn't in the military. And my friend said, "I'm not coming to you to talk about my military stuff and expect you to be in the military. I'm coming to you with my human stuff and expecting you to help me with the human stuff," right? So there is a part that's on the client to be able to be open and receptive to that. And at the same time, I, as a veteran, even as a combat veteran, as a mental health provider, I'm not thinking that I know all about every client that comes into my office just because, they were a combat vet, right? Heck, people that were in the same vehicle as me had a different experience of the war as me, much less somebody who served in a different era and a different theater and stuff like that. So really it's about being open and able to and willing to listen to that individual veteran's story without any preconceived notions and helping them work through what's knotting them up rather than trying to tell them this is what your problem is.
Yeah. Wow, Duane, thank you so much, like I said, for the work that you're doing. Where can people find, I know Headspace and Timing with the veteran mental health. Yeah, you want to give people the URLs and where they can find you on social media?
Yeah, so I'm a pretty big guy, both in real life and online. So it doesn't take, as long as you spell my name right, it doesn't take long to find me. But veteranmentalhealth.com is the location where a lot of this stuff is. I am on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. I don't have a TikTok. I have my limits, right? Yeah. So I leave that to my. That's good. Yeah, definitely. But yeah, so generally veteranmentalhealth.com is the place, and then all my social media and the blogs and the podcast can be found from there.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to see what you come up with next and checking in on the different podcasts that you're a part of and the books. Again, thank you. I wish you a happy Memorial Day. I hope you get to celebrate and relax and enjoy the time with your family. Take care.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
And there you go, OTC listeners. Another episode done and in the books. Thank you for stopping by and supporting the show. And definitely, if you know someone that's struggling, if you yourself are struggling, please check out the Military and Veterans Crisis Line at that 1-800-273-8255, or the website is veteranscrisisline.net. And then with regards to Duane, you can find him at veteranmentalhealth.com. So you can check out the different podcasts that he's a part of, the Headspace and Timing show, which he mentioned is on hiatus, or the Seeking the Military Suicide Solution, as well as any of the books that he's written. So again, it's such an important topic. Our veterans, our military, they do so much for this world, this country. They give so much, and just the idea of being able to give back to them and connect them with resources for improving their mental health and dealing with some of the cost of devoting their lives to our freedom. We owe them that much at the very least. So for any of you that are in the military, I from the bottom of my heart, I can't state it enough how much I love and respect and am so grateful for what you have sacrificed for us. So thank you. Well, if you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're catching this podcast. You can check out detailed show notes and any other resources given in the show at www.pfsonthecouch.com. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming episodes, guests, or contribute questions to the show, be sure to follow along on any of your favorite social media platforms. The author and host of this podcast is not engaged in a therapeutic relationship with the listener and cannot give counseling advice without a confidential appointment. Listeners should be sure to consult with a licensed therapist in their area or seek emergency medical attention if they are experiencing psychological difficulty. A special thanks to the band The Topsy-Turvies for the show theme song. Their song, Like a Living Dead, can be found at topsyturvies.bandcamp.com. The bump interview track was the song 1973 by Bruno E. The author and host of this podcast is John Dennis. Special thanks to show editor Casey Lehman and show producer Trevor Groff.